and ready to go. All right, we're going to get started. Our concluding panel, so if everybody finds their assigned seat. I don't know.
That's too soft.
All right, we're going to get going now. All right. Can we bring the folks who are in? Yeah. Jump back. All right, we are now in the home stretch. Thank you for hanging in there. We're going to proceed with the concluding panel. My name is Reinhold Martin. We've met before. I direct the Temple William Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture at Columbia, co-organizing this wonderful event. And I've learned a huge amount from all of you, and I look forward to continuing to listen and learn more. Just by way of just making a few remarks to open up this panel, titled with this sort of foreboding title, "Is this democracy?" question mark. First say just a couple of words about what we've been really echoing what Jacob said in the morning about the work we've been doing at the Buell Center to pose questions like this. I appreciated that it was pointed out these are the big questions, and that has been our intent, and to set up an infrastructure for a kind of critical conversation around these kinds of questions. The Power website that Jacob previewed for you this morning is the sort of tip of the infrastructural iceberg that is the Buell Center Power Infrastructure in America. I think it is quite appropriate that we are discussing this here on the Great Mississippi, watching the barges go by and discuss and with Captain Power, I think, back in action over there. So if you have a chance, have a look at the site. If anybody has any thoughts, has anything they think would be appropriate, that they might be interested in contributing to join the conversation that is starting to form on that site. It really is also intended as a teaching tool, a teaching resource. We imagine this, we'll see, but we imagine that anybody from high school student to a graduate student and beyond, including their teachers at all these levels, might find some of the material on the site useful. So one answer to the question, what is to be done, I think that many of us could say with confidence, is to teach and teach more. Beginning with ourselves, teach ourselves, and do it together, and do it all the time. Okay. So in that spirit, also a little bit to continue the spirit of just the last conversation we just heard, I just want to offer sort of 4 axioms that might help, I'm thinking about that might help translate from what broadly could be understood as a kind of managerial idiom that we've become quite comfortable with, terms like resilience, affordability, and so on, in discussing the matters that are under discussion, to a political discourse, to what we could call a properly political discourse. In order to try to just mark a few moments in that kind of a transition, or we could call it a recovery, to recover political language for some of these questions, I just wanted to mention these 4 points. The first one is to consider climate change as a project. In other words, I think at this point, anybody who is denying the existence of climate change is basically lying. And so, I think I think at this point we really have to start calling this out and sort of saying, no, you don't deny, nothing is being denied here, this is a lie. And it's an outright lie, it's being authorized, officially and reproduced at every level. So, and the nature of this project, a potentially genocidal one, as we well know, is, I think, basically in two parts. The first part of the project is to maximize profit. In other words, the resources have to, a huge amount of capital has been, as we've been seeing on the barges, the coal barge that we saw earlier, has been sunk literally into the ground. And the resources to which that has been addressed, fixed capital, have to be extracted, and that takes time. So this line is strategic. It's about buying time. Okay, that's part one. The second one is to minimize democracy, and that is, in a sense, I think, what we're trying to get at here. And I'll just leave that to discuss. The second point has come up quite a bit, I think, during the day. Just did again, is to think the climate question as the housing question. To say basically these are the same thing, and so therefore go back and read Friedrich Engels' classic 1872 text, The Housing Question, read what he says about bourgeois reform, and translate it forward into this what is to be done conversation that we're having today. Okay, enough said on that. Number three, to think the oikos, this is the Greek term for the household, as the polis. As the city, as the site of political action, which is to say, to think of the space of care and cultivation, care for the land, care for one another, as a political site, the site for the practice of politics, or to put it in a more sort of formal sense, where the to recognize that the oikos this is the root, the oikos root of the term ecology and economy, as the sort of primordial site of racial and gender violence. The household in ancient Athens was the space to which women were principally confined, and it was also the space in which slaves were, that was maintained by slaves. That this is the principal site of political struggle today, writ large. I mean, that's basically what we're talking about. And then finally, number four, to translate the term community into citizenry. In other words, to move from, again, the kind of managerial idiom of community engagement and so on, to voting and other political actions. And to think that to recognize, this was quite striking to me early on in the, what is it called, the evacuation sites. That the most vulnerable population, I gathered from the presentation, were the non-voters, were the undocumented people who cannot risk exposing themselves in public, even in that way, to the state. So if we think the problem of the various problems of community belonging as questions of citizenship, and translate those to a planetary scale, I think then maybe we start building a kind of conceptual infrastructure and maybe even a lexicon to help do the work of teaching, thinking, acting together that I think we all know that we need to do. Okay, those are just a few opening thoughts, and now I'm going to just quickly introduce my colleagues on the panel, and we'll just go right into the presentations. So to begin, Charles Allen. Charles is a native and lifelong resident of New Orleans, and he's the Community Engagement Director for the Gulf Coast at the National Audubon Society. Where the entire focus of his work is on diversity, equity, and inclusion, by working to enhance Audubon's reach to underrepresented communities in the Gulf Coast region. He's also a devoted member and elder of the St. Paul Church of God in Christ, which is located in the lower 9th Ward, the community of New Orleans. Following Charles will be Cedric Johnson, who's an associate professor of African American Studies and Political Science at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His teaching and research interests include African American political thought, neoliberal politics, and class analysis and race. Cedric's book, Revolutionaries to Race Leaders, Black Power and the Making of African American Politics, on Minnesota Press. We share a publisher, excellent. The Beale Center had a book series with Minnesota Press too. So. Was named the 2008, this is a truly honorable affiliation, 2008 W.E.B. Du Bois Outstanding Book of the Year by the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. Johnson is the editor of a book you probably, everybody here knows, The Neoliberal Deluge, Hurricane Katrina, Late Capitalism, and the Remaking of New Orleans, again on Minnesota, 2011, and his writings have appeared very broadly in New Political Science, Jacobin, New Labor Forum, Souls, Journal of Developing Studies, and In These Times. In 2008, he was also the John Garlock Labor Educator of the Year, nominated by the Rochester Central General Labor Council and of the AFL-CIO, and Cedric is an assembly representative for the UIC United Faculty Local. Following Cedric is Margarita Joubert. Margarita is co-founder of Aldi Joubert Architecture and Landscape, and associate professor of architecture at Tulane, at Tulane University. I was going to say here at Tulane, we kind of are here at Tulane, but almost. At Tulane University, she's taught at the university, previously at the University of Virginia as a research faculty member and a professor in practice, and was tenured there as associate professor quite recently in 2018. Margarita is co-author with Alex Wall of the book Ecologies of Prosperity of 2019, and another book on Akhtar, The Water Park from 2008. Her design and scholarly work is particularly renowned for its leadership in a new approach to the relation between cities and rivers. Following Margarita will be Brian Paris. Brian is mostly going to introduce himself, but I'm just going to tell you that he was born in Houston, and he has been working in environmental justice for 20 years as a cultural accelerator and media maker, and he's going to explain to you exactly what that means. And then finally, Monksha Lopez, who's a political scientist, cartographer, musician, composer, and South Bronx-based environmental activist. So we return to New York. He teaches Latino and ethnic politics at Hunter College. Monksha is also a founding member of the South Bronx Unite and a board member of the Mott Haven Port Morris Community Land Stewards, the local community land trust. He holds a PhD from CUNY's Graduate Center and an MA from the Université Laval in Quebec, in Canada. His academic research revolves around spatiality, mapping, social justice, political theory, and Latino communities. His cultural criticism has ranged in publications from Dia Art Foundation to 80 Grados. His text and sound collaborative projects have been published by Bilingual Press and Edición Callejon. And his political writings on spatial and social justice have been published in Salon, Latino Rebels, and NACLA, among other media outlets. And finally, his activist work has been profiled by the New York Times, Omnibus, and Corriere della Sera. So, shall we begin? What are you going to go there? With Charles, okay.
Good evening. How are we all out there? Doing well? Thank you so much, sir, for that nice platform that I feel like you gave me and gave us all for this conversation this evening. And I hope more than anything, this can be uplifting, okay? I don't know how the other panels went. Hopefully they were all uplifting. But I feel like it's Friday. We're between you all and I guess happy hour or dinner or whatever. And so I like to always kind of just reinvigorate things in a spirit of optimism because there is hope, y'all, okay? But people will not perish because there is hope. And then also I find a lot of times in my work, as I've gotten older, I'm at 45 years of age now, I'll be 46 in July, I found myself more than ever these days channeling and rechanneling my great-grandmother. So to that question of, is this democracy? Honey, it is what it is, okay? It is what it is. And if you don't like it or we don't like it, then guess what? That means the world is waiting on us to jump in and fix it. And to lend ourselves to democracy, and also in particular the climate crisis and all the other crises that we're dealing with, lend ourselves in a very thoughtful and respectful manner. That seems kind of hard to do nowadays, isn't it? But it's not really. We just got to work on it. We got to work on it. We got to deliberately work on it, okay? And so, yes, that's my title there. I've been now with the National Audubon Society since June of last year, and I feel like it's the next very natural progression of my work. And where's my friend Austin Allen? Austin and other friends, yes, you heard correctly. I recently became an elder in my church, an ordained elder. So even us struggling Christians, you know, the church, God will still pluck you from wherever you are and put you to some good use, all right? So, yes, as you heard, I've been immersed since my time at Audubon in this work around equity, diversity, and inclusion, okay? Because at the end of the day, be it the climate crisis or whatever crisis we're dealing with, it's an opportunity, basically. Again, as my great-grandmother would remind me, it's an opportunity for us to engage one another in a thoughtful, respectful manner. Why is that important? Well, so we can truly understand where we're all coming from. And what's, of course, helpful there is some being empathetic, some good old empathy, you know, seeing if I can put myself in your shoes and you in mine, so that we can honestly understand where we're all coming from, so that we can help one another together arrive at the solutions that we know we need to address whatever the crisis is. Whatever the crisis is. Now that seems lost on a lot of us these days. It seems lost, maybe not on you all, I'm going to indict you all in this room, but it's lost on a lot of our world out there. The political discourse is just so nasty, it's so polarizing, you know? No one wants to work with the others anymore. And y'all, we are defeating ourselves, basically. And I love the point that you made earlier about honesty. Let's honestly embrace the fact that there are changes happening in our world as it relates to the environment, as it relates to education and healthcare. Let's be open and honest so that we can address the issues the way we need to, together, you know, with some empathy. So, we've been, let me get it to advance here. Okay. Oh, there we go. Let's go back. So, Audubon is also, our state office, I should say, is part of a 5-member NGO coalition. We're actually co-located here in the city over on Canal Street, 3801 Canal, next to this gorgeously designed funeral home, okay, Jacob Shane Funeral Home. Yes, it's important, you know, it's a beautiful piece of architecture next to us. And in the context of our work, we try to, again, be as thoughtful as we reach people, but then also bring people the truth, okay? Bring people the truth, engaging with friends and neighbors and relatives, not just in Orleans, but the surrounding parishes, understanding that they may not be totally sold on climate crisis, climate change, river diversions, but look, let's just try to understand where they're coming from, and they can understand where we're coming from, okay? A lot of times I find that that's what we all want more than anything, just to be heard, just to be respected, and that's important. That is important. And we know that for years now, this Gulf Coast area, Louisiana in particular, it's been predicted and re-predicted and studied and planned that, you know, we've been facing such environmental degradation and a crisis of coastal wetland loss. But now, it seems as though post the BP oil disaster and Hurricane Katrina and a few other cousins of Katrina that have come and hit us since then, we seem to be at least getting our act together better, so to speak. My good friend Denise Reed pointed out about the state's coastal master plan, and we're going through a few iterations of that. I mean, the state folks will be the first ones to tell you, they don't have all the money. We don't have all the money, okay? We don't have all the projects ready and teed up. But at least we've gone through a series of conversations. At least we've gone through and have developed an iteration of plans. And the state folks, as well as others, will tell you, we seem to be doing a better job now of hearing out those folks who are still, for their various reasons, respectfully against some of the approaches and projects that are being proposed in the context of this plan. But again, there's an opportunity now to come together as a family, okay? Come together respectfully. I know I harp on this point about family a lot, because while I don't have a wife and kids, y'all, I got a family. And when we get together for our get-togethers or holidays, the conversations can be heated. It's usually around politics and some sports, but at the end of the day, we try to at least leave the get-togethers still loving, still liking, maybe with a different perspective. Because, you know, I learned a little bit more this time from Aunt Gladys that I didn't learn previously, okay? Or Uncle Mike and his craziness, you know? So, as you heard, I'm an elder now in my church. And as we also know, faith-based leaders, faith-based institutions, the church in communities, that influence still looms large. So one of the ways in which I'm trying to bring Audubon more and more, and a number of my colleague organizations have already been doing this, is reaching people through churches, okay? So I'm going to tell you, I'm already right now very liberally using opportunities and ministries in my church to bring the knowledge and information that we and my colleagues have at our disposal to our people, to engage them in the thoughtful conversations we know we have to continually have, and honest conversations, okay? Honest conversations around the environmental changes we're facing, the solutions we know we need to come up with. I should point out, that's my pastor, Pastor Ernest W. Dyson, who ordained me 2 months ago as an elder. He's known as a very vocal voice, a very honest voice. This man's testimony is compelling. If he were here, he would tell you, and I know he would mind me sharing with you, that he was once a drug addict. He once OD'd. In fact, he knows to the day, April 28th, 1977. He said that's when he was just sick and tired of being sick and tired. And he recognized he needed to embrace his own truth in order to turn his life around. Here are some other pictures of engagement opportunities. Someone pointed out, I heard earlier about the very rich fabric we have in our city of social aid and pleasure clubs. It's not just focused on Mardi Gras, but there are other things we do throughout the year. And guess what? A lot of those organizations, hence their names, social aid, there are opportunities to further partner with them and engage communities around the tough issues and conversations we're facing. Recently, we co-hosted a workshop in the Lower Ninth Ward where we talked about birds and the importance of birds in our ecosystem. Now, for you all who know Audubon, you know Audubon for years has been in love with birds, okay? And I'm not knocking birds. But a number of us within Audubon have reminded them, when we go and engage people, let's not just talk about birds for the sake of talking about birds. Let's make certain that it's birds with their need to people. And elevate the point about people, okay? Yes, you know it. Look, when I went to some of my old neighbors in my old neighborhood and told them where I was working, one of them immediately said, "Oh, Lord, you're at the zoo now?" I said, "No, baby. A little bit older than the zoo. Came before the zoo." And so, you know how we have to come to our people, okay? Stressing the importance that this is about us as people. This is just some of the myriad of faces of partners that we have worked with and will continue to work with, and there will be many others, and there are many others that you don't see up here that we work with going forward. Again, it's about people. It's about our children. It's about the future. And we either can, like my grandmother would say, we got to get into this mix and really help to be that change we know we want to be, that we know we need, really change the conversation, or we'll continue to be at one another's necks. We'll continue to be stuck on stupid, like hit and miss, and not really moving the ball down the field. And so for the last, 3 years now, in fact, I was part of this year's 3rd class of Audubon staffers who retreated to Hog Island, Maine, to have a very serious and very tough and thoughtful 2-day conversation around issues of race and racism, the history of all of that, sexism, ageism, xenophobia, homophobia, all the negative phobias, y'all, all the negativisms, and begin to talk about how can we, within Audubon, do a better job of relating to one another so that we can also do a better job of relating to the communities we serve. How many other organizations have been going through processes like that? Where you're coming up with a plan focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion. You know, everyone's doing it, or a lot of us are doing it. I shouldn't say everyone, but a lot more needs to be done because we're a family. We have to engage one another better, or else we're not going to be able to address our problems. These are some images from a recent boat tour that we took, again, with some colleagues from Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation and elsewhere. We took them out in the Bayou Bienvenue Central Wetlands, an area southeast of us. And a couple of these church pastors were very familiar and are very familiar to this ecosystem because they for years have fished and recreate and brought family members out in this area. And again, they said, as much as possible as we come to their congregations and bring information to them, they say, you know, don't just talk about the birds and don't just talk about the water, talk about the job opportunities that will come out of this work. You know, the years and years and years we have ahead of us in terms of ecosystem restoration, y'all, the many jobs that will come out of that work. Jobs are important. It all gets back to people. We know elections are won and lost on jobs. And elections are also won and lost, as we now see more and more here lately, because we're not doing a really good job of invigorating more a spirit of get out and vote. Don't sleep, stay woke, you know? My great-grandmother would have also said, look, if you didn't vote today, if today was an election day and you didn't vote, don't come home. There's too much at stake. Too many of us, she would say, have fought and died for us to be engaged in that. The voice matters. The vote matters. And so I'll end my part of this conversation at this time and looking forward to the discussion and your questions. Thank you.
All right, good evening. I want to start by acknowledging the organizers of this conference, Brian Holt, Jacob, Andy, Carol, Fallon, everybody who's chipped in to make this conference happen. I've organized 2 national conferences in the past, and I don't think the expression herding cats actually does justice to what it's like to try to make, you know, academics especially all be on the same page, at least for one day or a couple of days. I also want to say thank you all, everybody who's here, even those folks who are not on the formal program, who have an interest in this subject matter. I've got to say that over the last decade or so, right, with the post-Katrina explosion of studies and books and other things that were published about the disaster, the multi-layered aspects of the disaster, it's been great to be a part of this broad network, which is ever expanding and ever deepening of folks who care about these issues, both for South Louisiana, but also the ways in which it connects to, you know, Superstorm Sandy, Hurricane Maria, and all sorts of other catastrophes. So it's been great to be a part of that. I'm a Louisiana native. I'm territorial. I am chauvinistic about this place. And it's been great to be a part of this also because it's forced me to realize how much I don't know about the state of Louisiana and its challenges. And, you know, throughout this entire morning, I'm sitting down, jotting down one, you know, new thing after another that I'm learning about what's happening since I don't live in the state anymore. I'm going to offer a couple of disclaimers and then I'm going to try to summarize my talk. The first thing is that I'm probably going to sound somewhat negative. I'll try to end in the spirit of Charles's opening statement somewhat positive, at least in terms of thinking about the possibilities that are in history that I think we might be forgetting, right? I don't think history is as bad of a story as we might imagine it to be. I also want to make these comments in the way of a provocation, right? So, you know, my time here is short at this conference. I want to say some things that I hope will help us to think critically about what lies in front of us and how we might move in a different direction. In particular, I want to push back against what I hear as some silences around the question of state planning, right? It's sort of operating behind us at all times. I think there's skittishness about that given the Cold War, right? People are concerned about, you know, socialist disasters, real and imagined. And I think there's also some concern about the standard narrative about modernist planning and its transgressions, right? Which I think are actually misdirected sometimes. And they also involve a number of different inclusions and omissions of what that modernist history was about. I'm not going to use the language that's become common in architecture and design and planning fields, you know, about equity, sustainability, livability, and even affordability, because that's just not my jargon or my language. I also think that I hope you all take a step back and think about where that language comes from and how it comes to replace other more social justice and stronger left language from earlier historical moments. So I want to do three things. The first is that I want to make a historical point about America as a democratic project, which will probably sound like Captain Obvious to a lot of people in the room, but I'll do that first. The historical point about American democracy, and to try to put a really fine point on American democracy as a minimalist democracy, or even more specifically, a liberal democratic capitalist democracy, which has all sorts of real restrictions to it. The second point that I'll make is more contemporary and analytical and has to do specifically with post-Katrina, New Orleans, and class struggle. I'll use that phrase within that context, right? I think it's important if we're going to talk about neoliberalism as an abstract idea, we should also think about neoliberalization as a process, who wins and who loses in the context of post-Katrina New Orleans, and how that sets up the kind of city that we all can enjoy up to a point right now, but also we're very aware of its limitations. The last thing I want to do is offer up a speculative claim, and I'm searching for the right word to get at this idea of sort of direct democracy. I'll unveil it at the very end of my talk. All right, so the first point, you know, America has never really been a democratic society. Let's just start there, right? I mean, I was a graduate student in the 1990s in political science when, you know, there was all this triumphalism within political science about American democracy at the end of history, so to speak, right? And it was interesting as a graduate student when we would challenge these professors about the history of slavery, the exclusion of women from the franchise until the 1920s, right? There would always be these interesting negotiations. Well, the professor might say, well, you know, it was still a democracy. You know, if democracy is ruled by the people, you just have to think about which people matter, right? And I think that doesn't solve anything, right? It doesn't get us any farther away from the problem. But we have to remind ourselves of that, right? That this is a country founded on chattel slavery. It's founded on the exclusion of large numbers of persons who were here physically, who were included within you know, certain measures of the Constitution as far as like apportionment, but who were not allowed to participate, right? And that was true also for unproperty whites. It's true for women who were largely excluded until, as I said, the 1920s. This is no small problem. I think this is why we're so preoccupied now with the symbolism of who gets elected, who's nominated, who represent the Democratic Party or any other party, right? We're still sort of living and trying to outlast those ghosts of the nation's creation story. It's not to say that it's not important, right? That we have different kinds of representation. I actually like that about this conference, that we see a diversity of persons, but also different perspectives in the panels that were crafted. But I think that there's some other things that we miss when we simply focus upon those historical exclusions, right? Those actually set up the the ground for various political struggles that unfold that demand a greater and more substantial democracy. So I hear a lot of students and even academics who will name the chattel slavery dimension or the exclusion of women and see it as like a conversation stopper without thinking about what it meant historically for people to fight for something else, right? People lived through that period. They didn't make peace with it, but they actually demanded other things. So we need to think about America's exclusions, but also the contradictions, right? The rebellions, right? Within the context of slavery. Abolitionism. We need to think through the power of radical reconstruction, if we're going to go back to the 19th century, as well as labor organizing and all sorts of other aspects of American history, which are incredibly rich. They're often diminished in some contemporary discussions, and I think we should be careful about that. We also, as a result of those exclusions, get, in various moments, a push towards greater social democracy. Now, American social democracy, as we all know, was also minimalist. It wasn't well, established compared to other places, but we still should think about what it was like and how it mattered. For the most part, it was organized, and I'm thinking here of the New Deal and subsequent legislation passed by the New Deal coalition after World War II. Most of it was developed on the terms of capital, right? I mean, that's what the New Deal project was about under Roosevelt's administration. They were trying to save or rescue capitalism from its own contradictions, right? And so much of the legislation is written by real estate lobbyists, written by various vested interests, and it bears their imprint. We do get some substantial gains from that period, and I think we should be careful about overstating the case sometimes. I've been guilty of it in the past. And then a number of things that we need to go back and do the detective work. Why did they vanish from American life? I was glad that Jay brought up genuine public works earlier in on his panel. What happened to the Civilian Conservation Corps, right, after World War II? I mean, here you've got thousands of people engaging in forestation projects, reforestation projects. People are building roads, developing the capacities of natural parks to actually host leisure and tourism for Americans in different parts of the country. What happened to that, right? Why did it disappear? It's something we should think about. I'll give you the answer in a second, but it disappears for a few different reasons that I'll talk about. What happened to the Works Progress Administration, right? And this is different from what public works would become. Now we say public works, what do we mean? You throw some money at some private contractors and they do what the hell they want to do with it. That's not what we're talking about during this New Deal period. Again, I think we should make this distinction or draw a distinction between the heroic period of the New Deal, right, under Roosevelt, where a lot of great things happened. I also, even though I've heard it evoked a couple times, I also want to push back against the idea that black people didn't benefit from the New Deal. I mean, we know that there was exclusions, but some of those have been overstated, and up to a point, there's some factual errors that have been widely circulated. The Social Security Administration did not exclude domestic workers and farm workers because they were, because of blacks, right? Because blacks occupied those jobs. The majority of both of those categories at the time were white workers, right? So it actually excluded a large portion, I think maybe around 1/4 of the white workforce with the Social Security Administration exclusions of those particular categories of workers. The same thing is true for the Civilian Conservation Corps, right? I mean, it employed one out of every 10 Civilian Conservation Corps workers was black. An even greater number of blacks were employed in the Works Progress Administration. But a lot of that stuff is swept aside for a safe narrative that, the New Deal was just simply, it suffered from the constraint of race. That was true. But I don't think, one, that wasn't totally true. And it shouldn't stop us from trying to do something better in our own times. That should be the main takeaway. Now here's where things get interesting. After World War II, we see an interesting pivot with the New Deal Democratic Coalition, the party, under Truman's leadership. What we see is an intensified, real estate-driven course of national economic development, which leads to a lot of the things that we're still wrestling with right now. And what's important for us to keep in mind, Some of it was done for purely political reasons. I mean, goes back to even before the New Deal, right? The idea that home ownership would be a good idea as a way of maintaining social stability, right? You know, debt encumbered homeowners do not go on strike, right? They now become essentially constrained by this new obligation that they have off into the future. And so, you know, there are a number of things that are done which seem as though they are for the benefit of the American people, but they have really specific interests in mind. The real estate industry, the private contractors, and others who have a bonanza of sorts in the construction of both public housing, highways with the Eisenhower program, as well as urban renewal projects throughout the country, and suburban housing construction well into the very end of the 20th century and even now. So I think we have to ground those things, right? Even that infrastructural, those projects that emerged weren't necessarily for the good. Let me try to rush towards my last 2 points. So with respect to post-Katrina New Orleans, right? We end up with a situation where there's a clear class war, right? I mean, I think people don't like using that sort of terminology, but that's essentially what we see. And there's black people on both sides of it. This was the point that I think Jay was trying to make on the earlier panel. And that I think up to a point it negates some of the racial justice talk that we hear in some of these conversations, right? So for instance, what happens after Hurricane Katrina? We see the decimation of public institutions in rapid succession, right? And the decimation of publics, so to speak. The removal of non-essential, mass firing of non-essential public workers by redesigning. The dissolving of the public school system, which had its problems, and we could talk about that all day and all night, but the removal of it had political consequences, right? Because most of those unionized teachers were African-American women, just like those public workers. These are unionized folks who were constituencies, right? There were people who would have pushed for a different kind of city had they been allowed to work and, you know, participate in the remaking in a direct sense. You also get first the forced evacuation and then the later eviction of public housing tenants, which was discussed earlier. And I think, you know, also the closure of Charity Hospital, which also had its own constituency of doctors and nurses and other people who cared about it as an institution. With the removal of those people, thousands of people from the city, or at least taking away their basis to come back, the material basis of their return, you end up with the kind of city that we have now, right? Which was property owner-centered recovery and reconstruction, without a whole lot of concessions to people who couldn't necessarily, you know, pay market rate housing. This is the roots of the housing crisis that we're talking about. So we got to be clear about that. So what should we do now? What is to be done? I'm actually torn about this. I think when I wrote my comments at first, I was clear, right? And then after listening to some of the comments all day, I sort of backed away from some of my initial conclusions. One thing I was going to argue is that it seems that a lot of us are talking about direct democracy, right? This is what we want. We want to see much more in the way of broad, public, or popular deliberation, if not control, over major decisions. We know that historically in the United States, Americans have demanded this. If we go back and look at the Black Power movement, that was really the most radical demand, was people wanted control over their lives. They didn't just want to be able to, you know, sip on an egg cream at a lunch counter. That wasn't the concern. It was like they actually wanted to have control over the things that mattered in their lives. Effective decision-making capacity. And unfortunately, that didn't happen in the ways that some imagined. But I think that's where we're going, right? At least that's part of the conversation that I'm hearing today. One word that sticks out for me, the French term autogestion, which actually refers to, it's roughly translated as like worker self-management. It actually means something much more fundamental, I think. It means essentially people's control over the process of production and social reproduction, right? It's something much more vital. And, you know, I'll end, because I already got my flag here. I think we have to move away from the sense that the things we've been doing, like design charrettes, like other forms of civic engagement in the process of planning. Those things are important. Keep doing them. Don't stop doing them because I'm saying something, of course, right? But they're not enough, right? Most often, those just tend to legitimate decisions that have already been made, right? Monies that have already been earmarked. That's not the kind of process that we need. We actually need much more substantial involvement and engagement earlier in the process, and not just over, the main projects that have already been determined, right? We need much more in the way of democracy. I'll leave you all with this. The other night, I took a cab back to my hotel, and I got into a conversation with this one cab driver. And at first, we kind of made small talk, and then we sort of ventured into both being parents. We both have 3 kids around the same ages. We both have two 20-year-old or adult kids. And so we're kind of talking about all these things we have in common. And we started talking a little bit about post-Katrina New Orleans, where it is now, what it looks like. And as we're driving, she really launches into not only her family story, right, of displacement, different places she's had to live, but then she starts to prescribe things. And when we finally get close to Canal Street, she says, she throws up her hands, and I'm like, you gotta put your hands over the steering. And she's like, why did they close Charity Hospital? She was like, if they were gonna close it as a hospital, they could have opened it up as like housing for older people. So she had like a few different ideas she tossed around, and I think most people do. But in this particular moment, our democratic institutions, in quotes, are not functioning. People feel alienated from a lot of these processes. Certainly the case here in Louisiana after Katrina, right? I mean, there's a lot of bad blood, reasonably so, towards the way the system doesn't work for everybody. So I think that's one of the things. I think once people have a chance to comment, to participate, to give their ideas, and have the sense that their ideas actually may become a material expression of the world that they live in, we may see something different happen. One last point before I close up. A lot of attention in some of these panels has been on the most vulnerable people who are marginalized, people who are racial minorities, folks who are oppressed. I think a bigger problem are those people who this is okay, it's working for the most part. That's the bigger problem. The people who benefited in that post-war expansion, people who got those suburban homes, who were able to get the construction jobs, who've been able to live for a couple of generations as fairly decent lives. Not only have they lived those lives in a material sense, but there's also an ideological commitment to the society that we live in, and a reluctance to let go of the things that they have. And that's a bigger problem for us. How do we move away from this totally car-based, society, right? How do we get off of that? I know there are a lot of solutions out there in circulation, but I think that work has to start somewhere else, in the conversations among the more privileged elements. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you all.
So, optimistic in spirit, but dry in its offering, because I'm going to read, so I'm sorry. It's not going to be a conversation, so I'm going to read for the sake of time. So, as a designer, my ambition, or the ambition, is to visualize alternative ways of inhabiting the planet. And so, I'm going to here make a speech that might be overly naive, but I hope it can spark a conversation. So first of all, we'll start saying that our Western model of progress has become the master exploiting the world. Now we are astonished seeing that this long, sustained, faraway exploitation of the global South during the 20th century is now coming into our own backyard, which are the Midwest and the Souths of the so-called developed nations. This situation is a perfect social milieu for fascism and tribalism to emerge, while big money keeps flowing into fewer private hands with the complicity of the status quo, which we are part of. Ecologies of prosperity. This essay advances ideas for the reform of our Western model of progress, our model of inhabiting the territory. This model of progress is based on a rapid resource extraction in an economic model of neoliberal capitalism. Such a model of progress produces ever-growing ecological disruptions and social inequalities. The reform, described in the following pages, aims to promote a different type of prosperity, which will inevitably change current design practices and urban economics. The argument for reform is structured in three parts: about economy, urbanization and nature, and planet of citizens. All seek the transformation of current cultural notions that are meant to contribute to overarching crises related to each field. About economy. A tripartite economist. I would argue for a reform in economics in order to decouple capital accumulation from well-being and wealth. Linking monetary accumulation to well-being is questionable when air is no longer breathable by either rich or poor citizens. Economic wealth is useless if the entire food system is poisoned. The goal of reform is to identify cultural mechanisms for the redistribution of social power linked to improving the planet instead of polluting it. Because a powerful driver of both collective and individual motivations and behavior is the notion that capital accumulation leads to social power, reform can involve adjusting the type of wealth that is generated. It could be a type of wealth that is not tied to illegal and polluting activities, but improvement in the soils, fresh air, the growth of forests, and the recovery of biodiversity. Such reform will maintain social dynamism, which is associated with economic activities, but it will introduce radical changes to its driving goals. It consists of an hybrid economic model that can control the manner in which capital accumulates, while also certifying the value of two other types of non-monetary accumulation, ecological and social. Ecological wealth, eco-wealth, will be based on the generation of oxygen, the recovery of oceans, the increase of biodiversity in the biosphere. It is a planetary wealth understood as a true collective wealth that we can leave to the next generation. Social wealth will be based on collectively accumulated cultural and scientific knowledge, genetic biodiversity, and social cohesiveness. Those three types of wealth with their currency, their own currency, monetary, ecological, and social, will be the three essential parameters for building the new social order. Urbanization and the conception of nature, the second point. Another hypothesis for this reform is that ecological degradation is today linked to a specific romantic understanding of nature as a cultural construct, very much present in the United States, in which nature is conceived of as an infinite and imperturbable medium. It is based on an understanding of nature as a sublime wilderness, which during the Industrial Revolution led to a societal relationship based on a mistaken belief that pollutants dissolved in the endless receptacle of air, water, and soil. Besides defining alternative societal relationships with the planet, another cultural construct of nature is critical for building new narrative about progress with alternative motivations. A new cartography of the contemporary natural world is a critical part of an alternative construct of nature that can partially reform the model of progress. Geothermal, wind, hydroelectric, solar could be alternative energy systems which are carefully integrated into urbanized territories and partially self-governed within an interconnected network. Instead of a modernist monofunctional production of energy, which we have today, driven exclusively by economic and technological efficiency criteria, and every time bigger in scale, the new vision assembles not only a dispersed multi-source energy system integrated into the urban context, but also reframes its governance. While one can easily argue that without large-scale infrastructures, demand of energy cannot be covered, the point made here is that without consumer awareness and self-governance, no consumption reduction is possible. Furthermore, without a culturally driven energy reduction transition, technology alone can solve the ever-increasing energy demand. The last part, the thicker part, it's called Planet of Citizens. Diagnosis. The real condition of a citizen with its rights and duties are one of the most significant achievements of Western culture is unfortunately giving way to the resurgence of all social rigidity, no longer driven by a regime of kings and serfdoms, but by monetary accumulation. Some contemporary thinkers are calling this new emergent social order neo-feudalism. This exceptional achievement of the condition of citizenship versus serfdom was raised during a long period of time, starting during the Middle Ages and intensifying during the revolutionary period of the 18th and 20th century, 18th and 19th century. The bourgeoisie class, driven by trade and nascent industry, sought to overcome the established old regime of kings, serfdoms, and social immutability governed by culturally conceived divine law. The bourgeoisie class led a sustained campaign to modify all laws and create new ones, paving the way for democracy and citizenship. These radical achievements occurred in the context of the emergent nations of Europe and America during the 19th and 20th century. Once it was finally defined and extended socially through class struggles in the 20th century, this delicate and critical condition of citizenship began gradually losing strength under neoliberal policies only a short period of time after civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s. In the 70s and 80s, paradigmatic political and economic change made it possible for capital logics to take national politics away from citizens and to move it into global private spheres. It was at this moment that private corporations, monetary funds, global citizens, and international institutions paved the way for free trade to operate. During the same decade of the 70s, in which political power was taken away from citizens, Western society retreated to the pursuit of individual freedom, assuming an eclectic postmodern condition amidst the nascent digital society, growing consumerism and a preference for moving away from the city to the suburbs. During this period of societal alienation from politics, the transformation of the concept of citizenship with its rights and duties slipped into an increasingly unequal and rigid state, threatening the stability of social coexistence. The concept of citizenship has lost its importance and consistency, not only in developed countries facing systemic inequalities towards accessing life resources, but also between different countries in the northern and southern hemispheres. Today, under a social order driven by monetary accumulation, the wealthy tend to escape basic democratic norms such as justice, transparency, or public accountability. The new global order appears to return to a sort of neo-feudalism in which extreme wealth and extreme poverty and slavery are two sides of the same society, while citizenship and democracy are increasingly weakened. This situation appears equally at the national scale and at the global scale. There are unequal conditions of citizenship on the planet within the global society. There are global slaves in countries that lack economic power, those second-class countries. The global slaves who work in unhealthy human conditions to produce our goods are not full citizens of the planet, and they neither have the same access to essential resources for political voice. Proposal: planetary citizenship. Contemporary reality suggests allocating planetary citizenship into the public sphere in order to deal with the commons and its complexities, and to significantly counterbalance the existing strong private realms at the global scale. While one can understand the fear of larger political structures of power, even question its value, today it seems no better to leave the global political space empty for the exclusive use of private interests. An empty political space that lacks a narrative about the commons might be a cultural cause of global retreat into urban and regional tribes, groups, and communities of similar people against those who are different. What is argued here is not only for the expression of a politics of the Commonwealth at a large scale, but also, very importantly, to connect this political infrastructure to as many scales as possible, including national, metropolitan, urban, and the neighborhood scale. Such interconnectivity, reciprocity, and interdependence are critical for forming a vast web of political infrastructure in which private and public domains must come into dialogue and interact to solve complex issues and to monitor one each other in order to avoid the tendency for either autocracy or plutocracy. Such a transition towards a more extensive and thicker interdependent political infrastructure can represent a step forward from postmodernity, which arguably reacted against grand national narratives that were willing to regulate autonomy to suspicious extreme. Certain stability can be gradually attained by strengthening the concept of citizenship for all at urban, metropolitan, and national scales, and by defining a common concept of planetary citizenship at the global scale. The notion of planetary citizenship would include the rights and duties to the planet, as well as the rights and duties of ordinary citizens within a global society. It would add to the movement of the rights to the city articulated in the past by Henri Lefebvre, but weakened in the last decades. Planetary citizenship would involve power, rights and duties, operating within a biosphere, becoming a city planet. The goal of planetary citizenship is not only to protect essential resources for life, for all human beings on Earth, but to also ensure the biosphere as a medium for cultural and biological biodiversity. One of the critical aspects of such a proposition might be to define within each cultural context and at a global level the amounts of energy consumption to transition to, and the politics needed for implementation. The transformation of existing cities and urbanized areas that are enormous energy consumers is critical to this transition. The transition will need cultural, legal, and technological innovations, which can be propelled by socio-ecological urbanism at the neighborhood and metropolitan scale. Planetcenship and human inhabitation. It is our responsibility to imagine alternative urbanization models which can empower communities. Specifically, this empowerment can be related to the management of novel micro-infrastructures of energy production and distribution. In addition to energy, other urban systems such as food production can be decentralized and partially governed by smaller communities which can form an interdependent solidary network at the neighborhood and metropolitan scales. Ultimately, people need to embrace politics in order to recover the lost importance of citizenship in the context of capitalist democracy and to expand it to the scale of the urbanized planet. The politics of the commons, including modulation of energy cycles of production and consumption, are an essential aspect of all climatic issues. Economic power and social orders can be reframed. Renewed political engagement will be critical when rethinking levels of production of goods and food, discussing strategies for population growth and the rights to migrate, settle, and prosper. This proposition for double belonging, citizenship, and planetcenship aims to define a fuller web of norms for interconnected private and collective issues. It will create a political infrastructure for the construction of a set of alternative ecologies of prosperity. As a conclusion, the last paragraph, the central hypothesis is that the model of progress can be transformed by implementing new cultural notions in three fields: economy, the conception of nature, and the condition of a citizen of the planet. Instead of the current mechanism of today's production of the social order, based on capital accumulation, an alternative tripartite economy can produce not only capital accumulation, but also eco-wealth and social well-being. A new conception of nature, perceived as more fragile and interconnected milieu, can be visualized through a new digital cartography in an open platform, which will allow for transparency and accountability. Moreover, the articulation of a condition of a citizen of the planet can help to combat neo-feudalism. the egalitarian condition of a citizen of the planet can inspire the legal framework for transitioning to lower consumption to discuss population growth, food production, and other global issues such as migration, illegal traffic, and slavery. With a view to the scales at which urban designers, planners, landscape architects, and architects operate, it is proposed that at this day and age, we must question the modernistic model of urbanization we continue to use. Those are times of crisis that need independent critical thinkers, democratic by conviction, to commit to reimagining another type of relationship with the planet. A sharp critique of our model of progress is needed, and another type of urbanism, socio-ecological urbanism, with a robust political aim can make a difference. It is an alternative urbanism that asks architecture and landscape architecture to broaden its goal. Although some communities and countries have already mobilized to reduce social inequalities and deal with ecological crisis, the fate of millions of people are left to chance, and their fate connects to ours. Crises have always been good moments to revisit and reframe beliefs and act differently. Thank you.
I came because I thought she was going to be here. Y'all like me. I'm tiptoeing over here, by the way.
Yeah. Feel free to step outside. We have a free mic if you want to do that. I'm fully aware of the podium architecture problems.
That makes me feel like a showman. I'm good. So my name's Brian Spadas. I'm from Houston, Texas, and I never had time to send a bio, but it's also just something that's really weird for me to do. I'd rather just sort of gauge the audience and figure out how what I do fits in to the audience I'm with. So I gave some very quick topics. I think they're on my Twitter handle. Cultural accelerator, media maker, and I've been working in the environmental justice field for about 20 years. I grew up on the east side of Houston, which is lined with miles and miles of petrochemical refinery, pipelines, storage tanks, one of the largest concentrations in the world. And so that's really shaped, my way of thinking about it, and has shaped, my own personal experience in health and well-being. So I just want to say that, and I think the cultural work is the term cultural accelerator came from a friend of mine, Tony Diaz. We've been working together with a group called Nuestra Palabra. Latino writers having their say. He's also a rebel with the Latino Rebels, and he's a writer and academic. But a lot of what we've had to do is really speed up people's consciousness and access and ability to talk about things and participate in democracy, right? So that's sort of a loose term that we use to explain our organizing approach. It's got to be fast. We're running low on time, and there's a lot to be done. So with that, I do want to answer the question of the panel, and then I'll just say a little bit about what's happening like right now in the immediacy of my world, and how that may play into the work that y'all do. So on the topic, no. So we'll go into there's no need to discuss that, right? So I don't know if y'all been watching the news, but there's been this incredible fire in Houston on the ship channel just about 15 miles from where I live, and it's, you know, the second disaster that we've had in 2 years. I know that people who are from New Orleans can remember Katrina, and then 5 years later, the BP drilling disaster. So we had Harvey, and then, you know, less than 2 years from that, we had this ITC fire, you know, which we're now calling a disaster. So 5 year span, 2 year span. You see why the time's getting shorter? Why we need acceleration in all of our work? And that comes on the heels of 2 other 500-year storms in Houston, and the year before Harvey, and then the year before that. So we're really dealing with the immediacy of these things, and I know it's often you know, difficult in Houston because it's probably the antithesis of planning. You know, the city has no zoning laws and is just you know, incredibly thrown together without much thought about impact or anything really. And I know that Dr. Bullard would say the opposite. There is planning, you know, because if you look at the populations that live next to these facilities, it's low-income communities of color, and so that's the reality. So I just want to start by showing you this video for those who are not aware of what's happening in Houston, and then say a little bit about you know, design and planning.
Researching the right mattress is exhausting. Why not do it in bed with the Casper 100?
I'm gonna quiet down the commercial, just because there's no need for that. So the ITC fire started 12 days ago. It started early morning Sunday. Many people had no idea, you know, what was going on. And the company, of course, did not make any alerts or warnings until hours later.
At this time, we are in a defensive mode, so we are defensive, and it is going to have to burn out in that tank, or until we complete draining the tank, which they are pumping out of the tank.
We want to make sure that we're responsive to any concerns that our community has about the plume of smoke that they're seeing, because this is an ongoing incident. Everybody is working. We're working with our partners to support putting this fire out. In the meantime, the plume of smoke continues to rise.
Of course, ITC is very sorry that this unfortunate event, this isn't an event we wanted or planned.
From the start of this up until today, right now, we've measured no hazardous levels of concentrations.
and I think, when I was listening to Margarita, it really resonated with the fact that, how can anyone think about these very long-term goals and participate and engage in a democratic process when this is your reality? And, even without the fire, there's constant exposure, to carcinogens in the communities of Deer Park, Pasadena, East Houston, Manchester, Galena Park, Clinton Park, Pleasantville, Denver Harbor. And, this was, just a reminder that the folks who are put in charge to protect us, who are supposed to have plans in place, to prevent these things or to mitigate them and stop them quickly, don't exist. They don't exist. And, I, after Hurricane Harvey, felt the same way. Most people remember that as a big flood event, a rain event. But there were 8.3 million pounds of chemicals also released into the air, into surrounding communities and neighborhoods. That was a climate event, and what I've heard so far are a lot of conversations about, houses that can deal with flooding. But we have to remember there's so many other threats that the floods exacerbate, that the floods, will put people in danger with. So in Houston, we have to think about, the massive petrochemical industry. In Baton Rouge and Lake Charles, here in New Orleans, I'm sure, the conversation is the same, Chalmette. So what we saw during that event too was another tank problem. At the facility of Valero in Manchester, a container carrying gasoline had a floating top, and the amount of rain just kind of shifted, the weight, and so it tilted, and that allowed, a large level of benzene to escape. And I felt like I was being poisoned in my own home, that night. And so did tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people, were experiencing just incredibly nauseous chemicals throughout the night and had nowhere to go because the storm was still happening. Alarm bells were going off because tornadoes were, being spawned from the storm, and the roads were flooded. So these are the other important things I think we have to remember because of those ideological, constraints that many people in cities like this feel. They're tied to, they're tethered to, and it's really hard to have a conversation about transitioning off of that, even in times like this, even with the frequency and severity of them. So it's just a reminder that I think the conversation needs to be really dynamic. These are just things that I can talk about in Houston, and if we think of the floods in the Midwest right now, what are those other things, the fertilizer, the runoff, that's going to create an incredible dead zone here, in the summer. That foresight and that level of planning that goes beyond, the home or the office, it's our complete way of living in this country and the globe that has to be challenged and reimagined, and that's going to take some work, because I think when I looked at the question too, is this democracy? We've sold this idea to the world as well, and I know a lot of immigration has happened because of that. People see America as this beacon of opportunity, and so when immigrants come, they're bought in, they're ready, to get educated, to get a job, to buy a home. Those are other ideological, dependencies that will continue us down this road of unsustainable living. And that's something that, I've been trying to figure out how to work on through the nonprofit that I work with, Sierra Club, of all things. And, it's difficult, but I think even like this gentleman here, is it Cedric? No, it was Charles. Yeah, like you said, every institution has to really think about how they're adapting to internally. And so in the Sierra Club, it's having to rethink how it does its work, who its organizers are, where they are, how they organize, what issues are they organizing on. Not so much about birds in Houston, I have to say, as you can imagine. So after Harvey, one of the things that I tried to do, and it was from learning of things that happened here in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and that was putting together a people's tribunal to look at the recovery process. And we identified 4 key areas where there were a number of groups working on really important issues already. One was housing. Housing was a big deal. So that became one of the topics. The environment, of course, because I think that encompasses, the conversation of climate change and ecological impact, clean water, all those things. Labor was another big important one. And of course, immigration. And we saw a lot of things sort of all coinciding and happening. So this idea of global citizenship, or just not citizenship at all. Why do we need borders? I got my shirt on. Y'all know that I'm from that. I don't believe in borders. The idea that certain people have privileges over others, and yet they're human just like me and you, and they're working and they're living, and they have kids too. Why do we need anything else? It's just doesn't make any sense to me. So I just wanted to show you all this website, the HoustonFloodMuseum.org. It was a site that was set up after the 3rd storm that brought floods to Houston, and we created a list of videos. There's some links here to learn more about the People's Tribunal, but we're sort of operating under this ideological framework called Just Recovery that developed after the 3 storms from 2017, and it's building on the work of people, community leaders, organizations from the Gulf Coast, and the Southwest. So I'll leave it at that, and make sure there's nothing else I want to say. No, that's it. All right, take care.
So, thank you to you all for being here still. Thank you to Fallon, Carol, Andy, Jacob, Jordan, and Rayhold for organizing this. My name is Moncho Lopez. I really wanted to start here. I'm going to try to do 2 things at the same time. It's really, no pressure having to close the conference. So let me see. So I wanted to start there, not because I'm a groupie of AOC, but you all seem to love her so much, and I wanted to remind everybody that she's from the Bronx, that's where I live, so it means that we are, meaning the South Bronx, I'm from the South Bronx, I'm originally from Puerto Rico, but whatever, so that we didn't also give the world like hip hop and electro boogie, salsa and whatnot, we also give you the Green New Deal. Okay, so she's hanging out there, like this is town hall meeting that is being recorded right now with Chris Hayes in the South Bronx with a few of my comrades in arms. And there's a guy there that seems that he wants to kill her, so it's, they're in the corner. So as a migrant, I occupy two very different geographies, my homeland in Puerto Rico and Mount Haven, the South Bronx. I heard here today that, you know, in a way or another, we're all migrants, like we move all around different places. I think that for me, fortunately, this is at the very core of who I am and how I understand the world. Let me take this out of here. Yeah, this is foresighted that you was talking about. So, as essentially, I live in the South Bronx and in Puerto Rico within two different conflicting modes of being. One of them, I'm a research professor and a political scientist. The other, I'm an activist, a neighbor, and a community member. I try to mix and balance, you know, being the academic and being the neighbor and whatnot. I have to say, though, that there is only one of those identities that, from which sometimes I want to bail out, you know. One general overreaching thought that, you know, I got from the conference is this idea that apparently, like when all these dynamics that we talked about here, about environmental racism and rentification, it's that we think, or people assume that capital or access to capital is going to inure them from all of this, and that communities of colors, we cannot deal with it. And so this is a way of, you know, like helping us out of the places that are desirable, like that we cannot weather the storm, and that capitalism can, which I think it can't. So there is you know, a big difference there. So in terms of scale, I have a friend that Jay alluded to him, Samuel Stein. He just published a book called Capital City, Gentrification and the Real Estate State. And so Sam texted me these figures, which I think are really important. So we can get a sense of the scale of what we're working here with. So global real estate is worth $217 trillion. That's 36 times the value of all the gold that has ever been mined from Earth. It makes 60% of the world's investment, and 75% of that is in housing. Okay, so our homes are the most valuable thing on Earth right now. At the same time, U.S. home ownership is at a 50-year low. 37% of the housing that is being sold right now has been, it's going to absentee investors. The rents in black neighborhoods, the amount of, you know, the acquisition power that goes into rent in black neighborhoods, it's 44%, so 44% of your salary goes there. For Latinos, it's 48%. While we have 2 million people that are homeless and around 7 million people that are precariously housed. This is what I have to say about this. And I think that now we can just jazz it off, you know, and riff off here, improvise. So we are not gonna community engage ourselves out of this problem. You know? Communities need to lead the way here. Okay? And so the other thing that I have to say about this is that this is, you know, you probably know that we've always had workers in the history of the world, and then our brothers Marx and Engels came and said, oh, what has happened in the economy with the Industrial Revolution has created a new kind of subject and subjectivity. So the worker now is the proletariat. Today, these numbers I think that show that we have new subjects, that we are all new subjects, new kinds of subjects, and that we have a moral and political responsibility to find, just as they did it back in the old day, about the politicization of the working class, how our residency, we've been talking here about citizenship, how it gives us a new potentiality of political action. How do these figures look in the South Bronx, more specifically? So we come back to a lower scale, you know, a sharper scale. We're the poorest congressional district in the nation. Hundreds of acres of our public land are for waste transfer stations, fossil fuel power plants, and diesel truck industries. We have ineffective or non-existing community engagement. We have the lowest rate per capita of access to green space in New York City. We have the highest asthma rate and obesity rates in the country. And 38% of our residents and 49% of our children live in poverty. The unemployment rate in our neighborhood, in my neighborhood, is 3 times the national rate. Only 50%, 55% of our children graduate from school. So I'm going to stop you for a second. So all of these numbers, all of these stats present a very juicy and meaty situation for some, and our community has in effect been, for decades now, a credit farm for architectural planning departments, journalist school in the city. Like this situation, this suffering is an industry, and not only for capitalist space. You know, this suffering supports dissertations, it supports funding for research, it supports and propels careers and tenureship. Of course, we are not the only people and the only community in this situation. Like we've seen in Puerto Rico, post Maria, and here in New Orleans, a similar situation. It's a cottage industry of concern that grows out of the suffering of our people. So now the people in Puerto Rico don't only have to deal with the post-Maria situation, they have to also deal with, you know, with academics with good intentions that help us. And, you know, so my point here is not that we shouldn't research or think about this in organized ways or systematic ways. The question here is from where we're doing this research and the professional grip and privilege we think this knowledge entitles all of us to. I see this as an urgent epistemological issue. How generous are we with our knowledges? How open are we about cold crashing our knowledges with the communities we claim to care about? We need to learn to hold at times contradictory knowledges and paradigms at the same time, so we can work in effective manners. When dealing with academics in the context of my hood and in planning people and architects, and you are all personally nice people, and just, you know, I realize how much of a resident I am. It is funny, my comrades in the South Bronx, my friends, you know, they're super proud that I'm a doctor because they supported me. You know, they saw me in the handball court and they were like, why are not you writing your dissertation? Go back. And so now they want to flaunt my you know, my whatever, my credentials. When people come, I'm like, don't say anything. I'm just going to be here observing what's up with these planners and the city people that come here, you know, to help us and to engage, community engage with us. So a lot of time I'm just Monchito from the hood, and like, you know, like Moncho community. And so I have come to understand why we residents see planners and architects and city people coming out the step of the subway and we run from the hills, you know? And it's like, there come the conquistadors again, you know, to finish what didn't finish last time. But sometimes we cannot run fast enough and we have to engage. Which makes me wonder, And it sounds funny, but it's like also an epistemological issue, you know? So it makes me wonder about the quality of the data that we have as academics, that we rely on. I don't lie while working and collaborating with people from the city or from academia, but I am extremely careful with the privileged information that I have and what I share. I know comrades that repeat what they think academics, planners, and architects want to hear. And I know that Big Danny just runs circles around you all. He has a world record about it, you know, lying to people, because like, how many times have people come to community engage us and nothing changes? Broken promises. So, how do we deal with this? The community engagement narrative, of course, feels inadequate. In the case of Mud Haven, it is also boring and repetitive, even disrespectful, given how many times we've been engaged. How about we move the word into communities? This doesn't mean we displace responsibility to communities. It means, and this is going to be like, we begin to transition to move ourselves out of the center of the picture by preparing communities to do the architecture, planning, the policy themselves. Let's imagine ourselves out of the picture, or in a radically different role. Help me think about it, because it is easier said than done. This is, I think, a self-evident and an extremely scary idea. As yesterday someone mentioned the event, someone mentioned something about being mistrained and you know, feeling failed by the education that we all receive. And so I know, I live in the South Bronx, like most of the things that I see in my community, like owe me and inspire me, but I also know about the depression, the bottomless poverty, the chaos, the despair, the planned and systemic waste and squashing of vital energies. How can we work with and within that? This process means, like Saida said before, also probably means a Caribbean mode of policy and planning. And we're not talking about the Caribbean, just the Caribbean. The Caribbean contains the world in itself. A radically different mode of planning and imagining. No more master planning people around. We don't plan on people. We let the experiences of those people in our communities lead the way. Imagine inner city Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, African Americans, West Africans, undocumented migrants from Mexico and Central America doing the planning. It sounds scary and exciting at the same time. I think that planning in this way, the Caribbean way, it's like a challenge even in the Caribbean. So imagine developers like Trump and Kushner and Bloomberg listening to this, you know, like, are we gonna have Caribbean planning in New York City? So I also think that we need to talk, we haven't talked much about this, about all the cultural aspects of why people want to stay in their communities in the face of environmental catastrophe and rentification, and how this relates to planning for our changing environments and landscape. It is not about cheap rents. It is not just about money. It is about the networks, the memory, the friendships, the shared culture, the chaos. If we don't connect culture and planning, this is just an academic exercise. So, to conclude, Cedric was talking about like this direct democracy. One of the things that we've done in the South Bronx, and it is why I have somehow faith in the process, is that we created a community land trust, which is both like a process and an aim. So we want to take land away from the speculative market, so residents of our neighborhoods, irrespective of their citizenship status or whatever, decide what's going to happen on that land, you know? And so it's not like we're asking them, it's them, meaning us, meaning also we decide. And it's again both a process and a goal of fairness and inclusion. And so this is something that we're working on actively in the South Bronx to counteract these stats that you see here, these maps that you see with asthma. You see there, like in the peninsula at the bottom, it's really red, so that's more asthma. These are our flood maps during Sandy. Our neighborhood, part of our neighborhood that were not supposed to get flooded, got flooded. This is how our shoreline looks like today. It actually looks even worse. I was there like 3 days ago. And so we are asking the city, like we're telling the city in an indictment of the city and of planners and of the system, like pass the title of these public lots to us, the Community Land Trust, because we have what it takes and we have the resources and the connections to take decisions about our own land. And of course, we're going to have planners and architects and landscape architects and experts working for us. We're going to bring experts, but they're going to be working for us. And so I think that you know, like to conclude, one of the things that we need in our community, specifically, I think it's the same here, is, for example, degrees to help people, you know, earn a living. Why don't we move our schools to the barrios and help the people there also by educating them in a way that earns them a diploma and a degree, and at the same time with that knowledge, those knowledges, we can help our communities. So that's what I wanted to say. I landed here in New Orleans, wanted to say something else, but then, you know, I got inspired. So thank you so very much.
So I think, thank you all, first of all, and thank you for persisting and persevering with us. Since this panel is, all panels about democracy, let's hear from the demos. So I think we just open it up right away. So what do we have about
whatever we want. There's a reception after this, but it's up to us when to transition. So
yeah, so you know, let's go for at least 15 minutes, and that way panelists can respond to one another as well via the conversation with the audience. So questions, thoughts, interventions. Yeah.
Interventions more than anything.
Interventions. Let us know.
Hey, I'm being great to say, look, hi Charles, everybody, thank you for those wonderful discussions. And I've been thinking all day about how it seems to me that the idea of democracy asks us to be kind of a one self, a citizen self, but doesn't, or let me say, at least the way it seems as we practice it, not our whole selves, a working self, a family raising self. And then as designers, we are sort of, well, I speak from a role of a designer at this moment, sort of split then as designer, not myself, as a citizen self and a working self and someone living in a house and a resident. And so I wonder, after all of your wonderful thoughts on this topic, what you might say about that in relation to our progress trying to address sustainability, bringing all of our concerns together towards moving towards a future without leaving our partial selves all apart, split across our dilemmas.
You can collect it, okay. Collect on the way up, and then we'll bring the mic back up.
Thank you so much for your presentations. And Cedric brought up the issue of taking to task and focusing also on those that have benefited from the order of things. And so my question is, you can speak to that. What's the engagement on that end of the spectrum?
So, one more, maybe, and then, so we have multiple cells.
Okay, one last thing to put on the table, and I love these presentations, is climate change is going to be so huge, and the amounts of money that are talked about in terms of investment are so massive. And so I guess my question is, are there ways that this is something that we should hold on to, that we should engage with this process? Do you see something new with climate change now, or does this feel to you like same old? New round of investment, new labels, but fundamentally everything is the same.
So we have multiple cells, speaking to the power elite, and climate change as paradigm shift.
I'm gonna try to tackle my friend Jordan's multiple cells issue. Because what comes to my mind, Jordan, is, and again, I'm gonna speak from my recent church experiences. So I teach Sunday school one time a month, okay? And one of the things I always try to remind us during that session, it's an hour-long session, is that, like you said, we all have many sides to ourselves. We are all complicated creatures and individuals. I remind us all that the path from home to church that morning wasn't, like the Jetsons, you just lift off and go straight. No, it was filled with twists and turns. So, to the point that I tried to make earlier about we got to be as thoughtful as we possibly can to make certain that we respect and engage, and this is what's tough. This is what's tough about this kind of work. Everyone's selves that are in them, every perspective, every experience, every complication that helped them to arrive at the person that they are, the set of experiences that matter the most to them. And then another thing that I felt like I heard you saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that even sometimes when you go through all of that, there's going to be a side of you that's going to feel like I lost while the other one won over, okay? So let's not lose sight of what might seem a little bit of a loss for the moment, because there could be an opportunity later on to bring it back up and revisit it. That makes some sense, okay? Because we all have these complicated sides of ourselves, many different sides. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to be the first to tell you, there are many different sides to me, Charles Allen, okay? I may sound like I'm this straight-laced nerd of a wonk, not quite, okay? And I got to grapple with all my different sides every day I get up out of the bed, okay? And I'm sure you all feel the same way too, I'm sure you all. That's my best stab at it, Jordan, okay?
All right, so the question of who benefits, let me put a finer point on it. I wasn't just referring to elites in a sense, but right. So I was referring more so to the very consumer middle class, which expanded out of that post-war period I was discussing, and us. It's us, right? It's not just the people outside, or you can point the finger in a lot of different directions. But we're all implicated, right? We all benefit up to a point with the status quo. And part of that comment was about how do we address that? Because I think that's the main problem. Let me offer an example of this. I saw Avi Lewis and Naomi Klein's film, This Changes Everything, when I went to, I think it played at the Music Box Theater in Chicago. Packed theater, right? They're there to present and talk about the film afterwards. And after it was over, I sat there and I was like, this film was really about, indigenous peoples who were in peril, right? Landless peasants, whatever, different parts of the world. That's a problem. But the culprits were sitting in the audience, and there was no discussion of us, the kind of society we live in, the one that we sort of take for granted, right? We expect to, this sort of seems sort of simplistic. I'm going to toss this bottle out. We're going to toss, so many different things, disposable parts of the culture, without even thinking twice about it. I mean, even our clothes nowadays are like disposable up to a point. So there's layers of complicity. There's also the planned obsolescence that we're all a part of. And we have to take part in it in order to survive, right, in order to go about it. So I think there's a deeper kind of conversation. I think that some of the discussions about whiteness are trying to get at that problem, but I think they fail in part because it's not just about white middle-class suburbanites. They're the symbol of the society that created the post-war period. But we know that in the 1970s and 80s, even in the 60s, I mean, the suburb, not suburb, but the neighborhood we visited yesterday, there's black middle class neighborhoods that have been built in that same period, right? Pontchartrain Park here, Southern Heights was almost built at the exact same time in Baton Rouge, right near Southern University. Country Club Hills, Chatham, all these other neighborhoods in Chicago. The same thing in Prince George's County, Maryland, right? A number of different majority black suburbs. So I think there's a broader problem that can't be reduced into strictly about racial, white suburban middle class that we have to get to, right? And I don't really know where to start as far as how to have that kind of conversation. I think it has to happen within the context of real political fights. And so one example could be a discussion of decommodifying higher education, right? As one example. And when you talk about things in those concrete terms, you can actually find people across the board who are willing to support it for different reasons. And I know whenever I talk to students about free higher education, they immediately latch onto it because they're like, they don't want to emerge from a college education with debt. When we talk to their parents, they also don't want their kids to emerge from a college education with debt. So I think there are tangible things we can talk about and solidify support for, as opposed to getting into this sort of therapeutic kind of conversation about historical wrongs. I mean, that conversation needs to happen. Those sorts of discussions should happen, but they don't necessarily tell us where people are going to move, what kinds of issues they're going to support in real time and space. So that would be my kind of long and circuitous response. Go ahead.
All right, I'm going to have to
Go ahead.
disagree with you respectfully.
Sure thing.
Yes, of course, we all contribute to some degree because of the fact that we're here in the U.S. And the U.S. is one of the most, biggest contributors to climate change. I live in the county that contributes the most in the U.S. too, and I think about that. But we also know that there are glaring disparities, and that the people who contribute the least feel the impacts the most. And a lot of choices are not choices, actually. They are systemic impediments that prevent people from living the way they would like to live. So they're forced to participate in this economic system just to survive. So I wouldn't count that, I don't think, And one simple little thing is just like in Latino communities, we like chickens, but they'll penalize families for having chickens. But once it becomes cool and hipster, then you have little chicken coop tours throughout the neighborhood. Just little things like that that really shift people's cultural ideologies. They're part of their, heritage and culture. Slowly over the years, historically, but also even still today. And we know that just a few corporations have put a large majority of the carbon into the atmosphere too. And they lied to us about it. And they kept the science from us. And they continue to do so. So I think those are really important, to consider. And I think if you talk to folks, that especially recent immigrants, and you see their lifestyle, like the fact that we have AC in here, yeah, we're contributing to it, but I didn't choose to turn it on. It's nice outside, These things, I think, if we had choices and we had, opportunity to shape, our own environment, if we had agency, self-determination, I think many neighborhoods would look very different and they would be structured differently. And I feel like that's what's happening, in the Bronx, and I'd love to try and make that happen where I live too. Yeah.
Get to the paradigm shift question. Anybody want to take that up?
Maybe. So, no, I would say just one thing is that to the climatic issue, I would talk about the energy as a main reason or cause of all these consequences we've seen on several neighborhoods and cities, etc., etc. I think that the issue of the climate is, I would say that can be summarized on this idea of no more junkyards on the planet. So no more big energy extraction facilities, no more energy production facilities or big waste facilities. So we may have to live with a small energy we're able to harvest at a smaller scale. So the idea of having a limit, that in the organic societies we had a limit. We were living with the resources we had available, like the earth and nitrates and all that. But because our way of system looks like it's a way of life that has no limit, we just consume as much as you can, it seems that if we put for ourselves a limit, which is this idea of an infrastructure that generates energy, that it's not a big scale, but it's a scale that gets integrated into urban context in a way that is not producing citizens of second class and third class, etc. So it's an infrastructure, and that's a design problem, I think. It's a problem of reconfiguring the archetype of the modernistic way of urbanizing, and it's rethinking our infrastructures. And that will set the tone for the new way of inhabiting the planet.
Okay, we have the possibility of one more round of questions for our distinguished colleagues here. Should people feel the need to do that? Yeah. Okay. So there is at least one more question. So we can do, pick up as many questions as are out there right now, or thoughts, or dissenting dimensions, and then we're going to quick transition kind of right away into our wrap. So.
Of course, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your time, your expertise, and your feelings. Now, to change the way we're doing things, I think what we're trying to do is take the reins and put it in someone else's hands. Well, when I grew up, I learned to drive a car by sitting on my dad's lap. He did not just put me there with the steering wheel and say, drive. I think that's what happened after World War II. All right, the economics, we went to all the other nations and we made some kind of loan thing going on that went out of control. I don't think that we should facilitate, but not completely the reins, or, give the reins away, but, help them along in learning how to use the reins. I'll leave that to you to discuss.
I just wanted to repeat what was said by the last speaker. And thank you all for all of your presentations and for the organizers. Thank you for making this happen. I think we need to have more of these conversations on a regular basis. Networks, memory, culture, and chaos. That really resonated with me, and especially as someone who lives in a very vulnerable place. I think that this idea of remaining and reclaiming in places that are on the edge is a place where I want to reimagine. And I think that, you can run from climate change and you can move to higher ground, but you can't hide from it. And so I'm just really incredibly grateful for this conversation today. And the memory and the networks. And thinking of memory not as a past tense, but also like this activation for future as well.
I have just one comment, and that is, wow, those numbers speak. That real estate numbers, if only we can teach people to be able to kind of visualize and comprehend what they're telling us. as we heard earlier, that when you tell someone the facts about what's going to happen to the land they're on, they seem not to be able to comprehend that that could be true, could be possible. So I think those numbers are so important.
All right, well, any responses to comments and interventions?
The problem with the numbers, the stats that Sam passed me, is that I think that they are Carl Sagan level, you know, billions and billions. It's like difficult to really comprehend. In terms of the memory chaos and that idea, so I've been revisiting recently the book. There is a beautiful book called The Uses of Disorder by Richard Sennett. And then I also, you know, my dissertation was, my mentor was Marshall Berman, who wrote also a beautiful book, All That Is Solid Melts into Air. And so I liked, I thought about that, this sense of being in a fragile space, as you mentioned. I link it immediately with the idea that Cedric brought of modernity, you know, on how these chaotic places, these places of fragility, of things not making sense, are also opportunities for growth, while, you know, you recognize the human suffering. But part of the existential challenge, I think, is how we channel that and how we reimagine these movements of contestation beyond pastoral ideas of, you know, of idols that we're going to be like Faust, you know, roaming around the forest, you know. I love the harness of the South Bronx. I love the creativity and chaos, the design or lack thereof that sometimes you see in our neighborhood. Here I've seen it also. And so those are the different types of knowledges that I think that we need to know how to integrate to reach a high level of, you know, societal maturity. And so yes, I'm always grappling with that, with this idea that I live in the Bronx. There are situations that are specific to us, but how can I, you know, how can I also escape that place that I love so much? So I'm running towards it and away from it at the same time. And I think that's something that I think it links with the idea of the multiple personalities. Yeah. The multiple personality disorder. That you need to, that we are, you know, a thunder already in a way, and these ideas of completion. Sometimes we look into the future, you know, science fiction, or we look into the past, idealize whatever was happening as a way of completing ourselves. It's like a fool's errand. Like, there are these different personalities that we have, and yes, it's a disorder, but like Richard Sennett says, like, it's the uses of disorder. What do you do with that? And so you try to manage it, and very important, like Marshall used to say, you keep on keeping on. You don't bail out. You know, sometimes I feel like bailing out from my urban and planning thing, you know, leanings, but you don't bail out. You stay there because it's you know, it's not only about ourselves.
I'm just wondering, because we're talking about modernity, but at the same time the statistics really point to a place where we're going back to the Middle Ages, where everything is about property, and the people who own property are just los terratenientes, like this is sliver of people, and the whole economic system is not based on, it's not even about the abstractions and the derivatives. We're going back to the medieval notion of economy, which is who owns the land. So we're at a point where modernism would be the futurism, because right now we're in the Middle Ages, it seems, that's where we're heading. So I don't know, it's just something that sparked, given the theme of modernism and the statistics that were just presented.
Okay, well, thank you all. Yeah, it is a kind of note on which to transition. Thank you for all these comments. So here we have a little bit of a game of microphone tag that we're going to do amongst the organizers to reflect on the reflections just very briefly. I've already said just a few things already, so I'm not going to say much more except to just to note that from, this is sort of the more official Buell Center side, we've been doing projects, this is a kind of ongoing project for us, in which we've been trying to work with colleagues beyond the coasts, both east and west, and in you know, kind of convening conversations like this, and then building on those in other ways, formal and informal. So in the spirit of the sort of networks that we were just discussing. The point of that is to try to connect the dots. And so I think if we were really to try to do that now, on the basis of what we've been discussing all day, we'd have to spend all of tomorrow doing that. And there's another conference tomorrow that Fallon has organized that you're all invited to in lieu of that. So you know, we'll just postpone the Connecting the Dot conference to another day. But that really is the point. And just to preview that, though, I just wanted to give one very quick example of the kind of thing we're trying to think about. When I mean, I can't even remember the date when we did this. It was last winter. Was it in Detroit? With some colleagues in Detroit, very different setting, much less formal, or at least much less sort of institutional, and then followed by a day-long workshop at Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan. We discussed emergency management. Emergency management as a technique of de-democratization, not as a way of addressing a crisis or something like that, but as a plan. As a plan to displace democratic citizens, the demos, basically, citizens, to strip them of their rights as citizens to vote, and of course, by extension, all of the other ensuing rights that come with democratic citizenship, in whatever form, however imperfect that may be. These numbers that we're just discussing now seem to me utterly incommensurable with any form of democratic process or representation, even the most formal and generic. And when you put, this is when you put the two things together, you understand, you begin to at least see the contours of what looks like a plan, a project. Not necessarily some kind of, kind of control room conspiracy in which somebody's sitting around a table working it all out, but rather a systematic transformation, maybe on the order of the paradigm shift, Daniel, you're sort of asking about, in which the climate crisis, such as we've been describing it, articulates with the new sovereignty that the term real estate and real estate development and property and so on begins to capture, and that now operates with a new suite of techniques, prominently positioned now, amongst which would be the technique of emergency management. I think this is something we can do together. We can do it, don't have to do it here right now, but we can start assembling, start mapping the techniques, the sovereignties, and the state of affairs, the conditions, in a sense, historically and in the present, that enable and reproduce these relations. So if anybody would like to join us in various ways in continuing to do that, with your own knowledge, with the knowledge of others, your students, your colleagues, please get in touch. And so you've already met Jacob and Jordan. If you want to send an email to the Buell Center, and you'll be corresponding with us. So we're sort of continue thinking about how to connect these dots and then how to act on the basis of those connections together. So with that, I offer the mic now to Fallon.
Don't everyone get up?
Don't leave.
Everybody stay where you are. There are very short remarks on my part and that of my other illustrious folks here in New Orleans. So one of the challenges of organizations and institutions that take on the responsibility and the challenge of connecting the dots is that, to some degree, they retreat from the places in which they convene with those partners. And those partners are still there to act on the ideas and the discourse that took place today and other times. And so, I'm going to speak, and as someone from Tulane, the new dean of the School of Architecture, just to speak briefly about how what we've talked about today is actually going to have any effect on the region, the locality of here, that especially given that so many of the people here have hosted us this weekend. And so I am no?
It's coming back.
Okay. I mentioned at the top of the day that I'm the Jane Babel Endowed Professor of Historic Preservation at University of New Orleans. And part of my role there, I've recently arrived, and is to direct education, research, and engagement, outreach related to preservation, but that immerses those preservation conversations and actions in a much broader lens of planning and urban studies, and connects it to a variety of different networks already at work on preservation, but just not with a capital P. And there's a lot of people doing that kind of work that don't consider themselves preservationists, in fact, would rather not be called preservationists, and that's a perfectly fine thing. I think for about a decade I was in that same bucket. I've since, to the benefit of the people at the Louisiana Landmark Society, where I'm a board member, they're glad that I've reclaimed the title. That is to say that part of this, my work at UNO is developing this multi-year initiative of collaborative research with community-based organizations. And so as of this year, which just what's happening tomorrow, I was going to show you the poster, but you know what? In the interest of time, there I have put the programs for tomorrow's symposium, Heritage at Risk, Climate Changes to Historic Preservation, on the table back there. Feel free to take a copy. It is a kind of opening conversation about these issues in a way that is a little more on the nose and in the ground for people who are less a part of these conversations. Not because they're not having these conversations, and this is something that has been said, of course, this day, but they're having it at church, they're having it in their neighborhoods, they're having it in, I was just at a neighborhood association meeting a week ago. They're being had, but not with those who make decisions about those same matters. And so this is the first kind of foray for that. And then that'll be followed after some, with like a research presentation with all the students at UNO who are working on, who are working with me on research that I'm doing right now in the Pontchartrain Park neighborhood. We've been looking at everything from the loss of historic properties. It's a Black middle-class neighborhood that's over 50 years old. It's in the process of being designated a historic district, but it's lost through the post-Katrina moment and prior blight reduction policies. At least a third of its built house stock, and that has repercussions both for accessibility for its very senior population, as well as, because of course the new houses will be elevated. But it also has issues of, it gets at these issues of memory. and of legacy and belonging. And so one of the other parts of this research is looking at the loss of land ownership amongst Black middle class families and the wealth transfer that's subsequently taken place, and to whom is that wealth being transferred. In some cases it's the state, and in others it is speculative developers, and yet others it is organizations that have taken on stewardship of green infrastructure parcels. And so this is very much a part of these conversations here, connected to these conversations, but not necessarily the people who are doing that work being at the table. So tomorrow is an opportunity for that conversation to unfold in more depth. And so I do invite you all to take part in that. And I invite you to email me if you have any questions or interest in this kind of research. It's most definitely going to expand beyond this one neighborhood and beyond the city of New Orleans. Looking for partners in other areas of the country, particularly areas that are dealing with kind of post-disaster demolition of kind of the post-war housing stock and post-disaster devaluation of property as a result of kind of the redrawing of the line, so to speak. So I am going to quickly hand off to Carol, who is going to kind of take on the Tulane side of this.
I'm only here to introduce our concluding speaker, who is just going to wrap this up. So that is the Dean of the School of Architecture, Iñaki Adai, whom we ask to please, tell us what to do next.
No way. Thank you, Carol. I would love to have have an intervention, but I think it's a little bit too late to extend myself. But I want to do a little bit of a reflection in the title of the conference, the Democracy in Retreat, but the second, the Master Planning in a Warring World. I think it's actually really provocative. I know that master planning is a conflicting word. I understand that as a holistic planning or comprehensive planning. And I will switch to the idea of urbanism, that I think it takes out this kind of prejudices. The idea of the city is the highest achievement from my point of view. The construction of the built environment of the social space. And I think that's something to really care about, is how we settle and how we use our resources. With the idea of the creation of the sciences of urbanism in the 19th century by Serrat and the general theory of urbanization, master planning or urbanism was the most progressive possible attitude, the most progressive tool to address inequality, to produce, to generate infrastructure. The biggest reduction in mortality, or the biggest change in mortality in humankind happens at that moment with new infrastructures. Biggest change other than war, of course. So I know 50s, 60s, master planning, especially in the US, had a serious problems, urban renewal, a non-holistic understanding of the idea of the city. So I would claim for the recovery of a holistic way of thinking, how we are addressing the built environment. I think the challenges that we have are of such a caliber that the only way to tackle them is through a holistic understanding of social, infrastructural, ecological, economical, morphological issues. And that brings me to the point about why we are in a university. I think in front of a corporatization of the world and the power and the decision making, universities have an extraordinary power. If we are honest, we don't use the cases as guinea pigs for personal promotion. actually producing knowledge. We know we have the conflict between the idea of university as this useless creation of knowledge to a more contemporary thinking in which universities are pressed by the grand challenges in the world, and universities are trying to find a way to engage with that. So the capacities of universities to take out from the private interest towards a public good, the idea of holistically looking at what's going on and how we can address issues, I think is extraordinarily powerful, or at least I'm really optimistic, confident, and that's why I took the challenge of coming to Tulane. I think it's a great place to be in connection with many other universities and to deal with how we are restructuring our way of thinking in our built environment. So thank you very much.
This brings us